on us and even shapes the ways that we sleep and how much sleep that we seem to need. Okay, so just to give a brief synopsis of what to expect here, I'm going to start off just talking a bit about how cultures come to be and how they come to shape people, shape the ways that they think. Then I'm going to talk about this idea of cultural fit, which is the alignment between the individual and the culture, and how important this alignment is for people's health and well-being. And then I'm going to take what's going to seem like a sharp turn to start talking about sleep across cultures. And I talk about a few recent studies that we've done on this. I find these studies quite exciting, and one reason because I think they raise more questions than they answer. So I think you'll see there's a bit of a puzzle that remains to be figured out here. And then I'm going to tie sleep back to this broader topic of cultural fit, and I'm going to argue here how or show some evidence that cultural fit helps to explain the relation between sleep duration and health. All right. Okay. So first, I want to consider the questions of how do cultures come to be? And cultures are influenced by the surrounding geography. So, for example, in a place like Texas, there's been a longer tradition of herding cultures, which tends to come paired with a culture of honor. It's something we see in many places around the world where there's been herding, including the U.S. South. Also, you can see places where that have had a tradition of cultivating rice tend to develop more coordination and cooperation with neighbors and have more collectivistic cultures. And cultures where there's been a greater prevalence of pathogens and parasites over history tend to have tighter social norms. So those are just so all the culture is constrained by the geography that surrounds it. But importantly, the culture that ultimately comes to emerges out of the interactions among people. When we interact with others, we start creating a shared reality, a set of shared norms, and this ultimately comes to form the cultures that we participate in. And it doesn't take long for these cultures to form. So, for example, one study here, which took place in the University of Northern Iowa, and one characteristic of this university is that the students are randomly assigned to their residences. Okay, which maybe that's not great from the student's end, but it's great from a research perspective because this allowed researchers to explore really the emergence of cultures in these different dorms. And at the beginning of the year, they asked students to complete a survey of a bunch of attitudes, political attitudes about the university, and so on. And then 3 months later, after they've been living together, sharing meals with each other, playing ping pong with each other, they completed the same survey of attitudes again. And what was evident was after that 3 months, they found that students who lived within the same dorm started to agree with each other more. There was some clustering of their attitudes. They started moving towards sort of a dorm-specific set of attitudes, and that each dorm became quite distinctive from the other dorms in this time. So after only 3 months, you see the beginning of these subcultures, these dorm-specific cultures where people, through talking with each other and influencing each other, came to create these shared norms, which influenced their own attitudes on these topics. So it doesn't take long for cultures to form. However, once they form, they have this stickiness to them, and cultures come to persist over a long period of time, and they persist because every new member to a culture really comes to a culture through one or two means. They're either born into that new culture or they migrate to that culture, and they then need to learn the local cultural norms. And after they've learned those local cultural norms, they've internalized them and end up perpetuating them themselves. And so we see that cultures persist for very long periods. There's a good example of this is looking at the Italian peninsula from 8 centuries ago. The differences between the cultures of northern Italy and southern Italy still largely exist today in similar ways that they did like 8 centuries ago. And I imagine if we came back to your university a century from now, there'd be a whole lot of changes over that time, but there's still be something distinctively Texan about Texan culture. That cultures do have this habit of persisting over time. Okay? And because our cultures form through our interactions, everyone tends to have interactions with different networks of people that we actually belong to different kinds of subcultures, and we have corresponding identities with each of the cultures that we belong to. So you can talk about people having a national culture, and that sort of part of this sort of shared national conversation, and that shapes the way they see and view things. But people also can have an ethnic culture, so they belong to a particular ethnic group and have a lot of interactions with those people, shaping their sense of the norms. People often belong to a religion, and religion is a really key source of cultural learning. It has a stronger influence on people in most other aspects of cultures. People have occupations. They belong to an occupational culture. There's sort of a set of norms that they learn with respect to their occupation. Even hobbies or activities like being a soccer player, there's sort of norms, a culture that people participate in then. Or even in fandom, being a Swiftie, that there's sort of a set of norms that people learn through interacting with these social networks. So we all belong to multiple sort of subcultures, and that we can switch between these, and our identities switch between these to a degree as well. And so uh, a key sort of foundational claim in cultural psychology is this idea that cultures themselves are mutually constituted. They make each other up. And so I've just been talking about here how selves create cultures through our interactions with others. We create these shared norms, the shared reality, which is the culture. But at the same time, our cultures come to shape ourselves, that they guide the way that we start to view the world. Um, I like this quote from Roy Baumeister, I think captures this relation well, that the self exists at the interface between the human animal body and the complicated social structures that we call society and culture. Okay. And that what research suggests here is that what happens with ourselves when we develop this self, we are internalizing the set of cultural meanings that surround us. And these meanings are sort of organized and consolidated so that they are very accessible to us, so that our default way of responding in any context is usually aligned with the dominant cultural meanings around us. Okay, so that we have this tendency by internalizing these meanings that they're very accessible to us, that we all share the same basic needs around the world, but how we realize those needs, how we satisfy them, is through culturally specific ways. And so we need to act in ways that are aligned with our culture in order to be more likely to be successful and satisfy our basic needs. But one paradox from all of this, though, is that despite that these cultures emerge in about these sort of shared norms and shared meanings that everyone's exposed to, these norms emerge from all of the unique individuals that make up cultures. That in any culture, people are different from each other in various ways. And so, despite that we are exposed to similar cultural norms, how people respond to them can differ. Some people may embrace a particular cultural norm. Some people might, resist it. Some might neglect it, and so on. And this is important for this next point that I want to bring up, which is the idea of cultural fit. That because there's variability within cultures, and variability that comes from some rather obvious ways. That one way we're unique is we belong to a unique set of subcultures that everyone has their own unique collection that's not quite the same as others. We also each have a one-off genome that codes a specific set of proteins in response to the experiences in our lives. And we're also unique in that we're all on a unique and specific life journey, a distinctive set of experiences that we've had. And so all these ways of that individuals differ from each other are important with regards to culture because it means there's going to be variability within any culture with regards to how close people are to a surrounding set of dominant cultural norms. So within any kind of culture, within Texan culture, within your university culture, there's a set of norms, and some people are going to be closer to the central tendency of those norms, and they you say that they have good cultural fit, that their selves are in tight alignment with that surrounding culture. Other individuals, in contrast, aren't going to be in such good fit with the surrounding dominant culture, that they are different from that culture, perhaps in a number of respects. And having this alignment with the culture, being in a way such that your default way of acting is largely in tune with the surrounding cultural norms, has been shown in a great deal of research to be predictive of a lot of different ways of capturing health and well-being. And so I'm going to first now provide you with sort of several examples of this from this literature on cultural fit, on the importance of cultural fit. And this is a really, I think it's the um, fastest growing topic within the field of cultural psychology right now, is studying how cultural fit relates to health and well-being. So, for example, here, people whose personalities are more similar to those around them, that is, meaning that how they score on this inventory of personality traits, if people are more similar to the median, the prototypical person in their context, they tend to score better on measures of happiness and well-being. Having a personality that fits with those around you is associated with greater well-being. Um, Another example, universities have cultures, and there's a pretty substantial research program by Nicole Stevens here, who's found that people who fit in better with this university culture, people whose selves prior to going to university are more closely aligned with the dominant university culture, tend to do better at university, and they tend to get better grades. So having this cultural fit matters at university too. Um, People who experience emotions that are in more alignment with the emotions that are commonly experienced from those in the surrounding culture tend to have more satisfying relationships, that people are connecting in similar ways. They're reacting to situations in similar ways, and that is associated with having more satisfying relationships. It's another example. People who are more religious tend to be happier and tend to live longer, and you see that around the world. But this relation is especially strong in cultures in which religion is common, that their particular religion is common in that culture. If it's in a culture which is primarily atheistic or primarily people of different religions, then there isn't the same to the same degree the boost to longevity or the boost to happiness with being religious. Okay. Another example is people whose self-concepts fit with the surrounding culture better tend to have healthier diets, that the kinds of foods that they turn to on average more often healthier. Um, having a fit with a surrounding political environment matters too. So Republicans who live in heavily Republican states tend to live longer than Republicans who live in Democratic states. Just um, being similar to having this similar views of those around oneself is associated here with actual better longevity. Um, and or Recent research finds that yes, obese individuals report better health in counties that have higher prevalence of obesity than in counties with less obesity. This is self-reported health, I should be clear. But again, this is showing that feeling that one is similar to those around oneself is associated with with a variety of kinds of health and well-being benefits. Importantly, though, I should emphasize that actually the mechanisms for why cultural fit has all these benefits have not clearly been established yet. And there's some debate about a few different ways that cultural fit matters. One is it could just be the subjective experience that I feel normal because I'm like the people around me. And so you don't question what you're doing and you think what you're doing is appropriate. So it could be a subjective experience. It could also be more of an objective issue of fit that people who don't fit well, that their lifestyle might just be at odds with the norms around one, and so creating some conflict, creating friction in the things that they want to do and what is commonly done in a culture. So it could be this friction, or it could also be a product of some individuals being more atypical genetically, and that might just be associated both with fitting in less into that cultural context and having a worse health or worse well-being. And so those are three possibilities that actually the research hasn't been able to disentangle yet. But please keep those in mind because I'll be returning to them when I talk now about, I'm going to talk how sleep relates to this idea of cultural fit. So I just want to talk a bit about the idea of culture and sleep. So sleep is a basic physiological process you see common throughout the animal kingdom. So all vertebrates sleep in some way or another, although there's some variability in how they sleep. And sleep has a number of key, really fundamental physiological functions that have been identified. So, one, we sleep to conserve energy. We also sleep to get well rested and sort of to restore ourselves and engage in cellular repair. And when we're sleeping, this is when our memories are being consolidated and when our brains are being detoxified as well. So these are some very basic physiological functions of sleep. And perhaps it's a little surprising then, given how basic sleep is as a physiological need, as you see it across the animal kingdom, there are a number of ways that sleep is shaped by culture. And I'll first consider a few of these that you've probably heard about already. So, for example, cultures vary in whether they have norms for co-sleeping. This is one where the US really stands out in the world as having the least co-sleeping in the world, or at least from a survey of 100 different cultures around the world, the US had the least co-sleeping, especially among white Americans. Most of the world co-sleeps, meaning that kids sleep with adults up to, well, it varies with the culture how old, but often until their middle childhood. It's really quite common, not so common in many Western cultures. Um, Other ways of seeing how cultures vary, they vary in some cultures have a biphasic sleep pattern where they have a sleep in the middle of the day. And cultures with a siesta, it's often like a designated time of the day where people are expected that this is when you take a break and have a siesta. Most cultures don't. And the number of cultures with siestas has been declining in recent years. It seems that this is a way of life is hard, perhaps, to integrate with the norms of modern industrialized countries. Some cultures have higher tolerance for public naps. Japan is one of those. I've spent a lot of time in Japan, and this is what you see often on the trains, people sleeping when they get a chance. I think it's also some testimony to how safe Japanese trains are that people feel quite comfortable falling asleep in situations like that. Um, Another way that cultures vary is that looking back in the historical record in Europe, looking at texts written in medieval Europe, they often talk about there being two sleeps at night, and that people would they didn't have electrical lighting, and so people would often go to sleep when it started to get dark, but then they would wake up in the middle of the night. They might tend the fire, fix themselves some food. Maybe they'd have sex. Maybe they'd have a conversation with someone else who's up before going back to sleep. And you also see that in some small scale societies today, this kind of this pattern of interrupted sleep. And one study found that if you put people into a room without windows for several days, that their sleep ultimately adapted to this similar kind of interrupted sleep pattern. So this might be something that's quite common when we when we're in the dark for a long period of time. Okay. But other ways that cultures vary in their sleep is in terms of their sleep environment. So I'm going to make some predictions on what your sleep environment is probably like. I bet you try to sleep in a room with very little sensory stimulation. So you want a dark room. You also want it quiet, or at least without. You don't want to hear noises. Many people rely on a white noise machine, to block out any sounds. You don't want to hear any sounds that might wake you up. You want the room to be warm, but not too warm. Really, it's a very narrow degree of that many people have for being comfortable sleeping. Couples often disagree on how warm the room should be. And you also probably sleep on some comfortable bedding. You want it soft, but not too soft. And again, they even make special beds for couples here who might disagree in how soft a bed should be. So this is kind of the sleep environment I'm expecting that many of you have. This is not the kind of environment that humans evolved in by any stretch. Maybe gain some insight looking at what sleep is like in some foraging societies. So, example, this is just a picture of a Hadza man in Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunting-gathering societies, that sleep is there's a lot of sensory stimulation, and that you hear all of the sounds of the savannah. You hear the sounds of people talking. There's light from the fire. There's light from the sun and from the moon. Not much in the way of comfortable bedding. The temperature outside is the temperature that you're sleeping in. So just a very different kind of sleep environment than perhaps what many of you are experiencing. Okay. But I think what's striking, though, too, is that people in different cultures can vary in their attitudes towards sleep. And in particular, in Japan, people seem to view sleep as something that's less essential for healthy functioning. And this is something that I've been struck for a long time now. After my undergrad, I went and I taught English for 2 years in a small town in rural Japan. And this has been bugging me ever since that time because it was just so striking to be how little it seemed um, that many of my Japanese friends were sleeping. So, for example, sometimes at night in the town, I would run into some of my students who were junior high school students, 13 years old. I'd run into them, it'd be about 10:30 at night, and it's a school night, and I'd be like, "Wow, you guys should be home sleeping by now." And they'd say, "No, no, we're just coming from cram school." So they had after school cram school that they're going in. And then they would say, "Oh yeah, and I haven't eaten yet." Someone else saying, "I still have homework to do. I'm gonna go watch TV." And I'd be like, "You guys should be getting some sleep." And they all seemed to think this was a very odd idea that I was suggesting to them. And you can see this idea expressed. This is one expression you often hear in Japan for students who are studying for the notoriously difficult university entrance exams, that students spend many months, if not years, studying for these. And the expression yonto go raku literally means you'll pass with if you cut your sleep down to 4 hours a night. If you're sleeping 5 hours a night, you're going to fail the exam because you're not studying enough. And this isn't night before cramming. This is for, again, like months and years. This idea, this aspirational idea that you should be cutting back on your sleep so that you'll be able to study enough. To do well on this test. And I find this a very culturally foreign idea for myself as a Canadian. I can't imagine, say, if a student ever came to ask me how can they do better in my class, to suggest, well, maybe you should cut back on your sleep. Right? I just that seems like a very culturally foreign idea, which I think is rather telling. And Ruth Benedict wrote the most famous ethnography of Japan, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, back in 1946. And she noticed this difference too back then. And a quote from her book is, "When one goes to Japan, one must cease to believe that it is a bounden duty to prepare for work tomorrow by sleep and rest tonight. One is to consider sleep apart from questions of recuperation, rest, and recreation." And the way she describes it there, an attitude among Japanese, common attitude, is that sleep is something kind of like dessert, meaning that you like to get it if you can, but if you don't get it, it's no big deal. Like you don't expect that, oh, the next day is going to be a nightmare because I didn't get enough sleep last night. There's not that same commitment to that idea that you need sleep. This is something I found very curious. And then this all leads to what I think is the most striking cultural difference in sleep, and that's cross-cultural differences in sleep duration. Um, this is just one of many international surveys that has gone out. This is from the OECD, and this just shows the different sleep durations of the many dozens of countries in this survey. And typically, what you see at the low end, always anchoring the low end, is Japan. They seem to be the world champions of having the least sleep, just over 6 hours, 15 minutes in this survey. Um, Other orange dots are other Asian countries. They seem to be the ones clustering on the bottom end. And then the countries that have the highest sleep tends to be in Western Europe and in Oceania. And these rank orderings are quite consistent across surveys. Surveys using different methods still tend to produce this similar rank ordering. And these are really large differences here of about 20% between the extreme ends. And so a question I've been puzzling about for a while is that, I mean, many of these surveys show these pronounced differences. Does this matter in any way that some cultures are getting much less sleep than others? And some reasons to suspect that it really should matter is if you read books like this, Matthew Walker's best-selling book, Why We Sleep, where he reviews the sleep literature, which highlights probably the most common finding I would say in the sleep literature is that short sleep durations are associated with all of these health problems, health costs. They're associated with lower cognitive functioning, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and a shorter lifespan. And even relatively small decrements in sleep duration have been associated with harmful outcomes. So there's a very large sleep literature showing that short sleep durations are really problematic. So how do we integrate this idea from the sleep literature, it's short sleep durations are bad, with these findings that across countries there are really quite pronounced differences in sleep duration? Should we expect that these countries at the bottom of this chart here are going to suffer from more health problems? It's not obvious that that's the case. Japan, with the least sleep in the world, also is the longest living country in the world. So it's not at all obvious that their health is being compromised so much by their sleep. Although one other thing to note is Japan has a very healthy diet too. So maybe there's other facets of the culture that is compensating for the costs that come with a shorter sleep duration. And why are there these cultural differences? That really, the sleep literature has been really a mute on these issues. So this led me to start a research program rather recently to help make sense of this puzzle here. And I've been struck by why Japanese gets by with so little sleep. And so being new to the sleep literature, I had a few, I think, naive ideas about this. One of these, thinking maybe cultures differ in how efficiently people sleep, that perhaps it's the case that Japanese are just more efficient sleepers. That's a possibility. Perhaps it's a case that Japanese are chronically tired because they're sleeping so little. And maybe that's why you see them sleeping on trains so often. And looking in the sleep literature, this is the only speculation that I've come across in the sleep literature suggesting that maybe there's ethnic differences in people that relate to their need for sleep. So maybe that most of these short sleeping countries are from Asia. Maybe somehow there's some, you know, genetic variants more common in Asia that relate to less sleep need. Those are the only speculations that I've heard in the sleep literature regarding these differences. So we've done a few studies to try to investigate this. The first study that we did, we had university students in Canada and in Japan wear an ActiWatch for a week. And an ActiWatch is like a Fitbit. It measures your movement and it can give various indicators of your sleep quality, sleep duration, and sleep efficiency. And we took advantage of the University of British Columbia, where I'm at, has it's really largely a bicultural university. There's a lot of people of European ethnic origins, a lot of people of East Asian ethnic origin. So we arranged to compare a group of European Canadians with a group of Asian Canadians, as well as comparing Japanese students. Okay, so I'll go over the findings from this. So the first thing we found, sort of reflecting much of this other literature on sleep, that we also found that Japanese slept less than Canadians. They slept about an hour less than our two groups of Canadians. And also, what we notice here too is you can see that it's not the case that our Asian Canadians are sleeping like our Japanese sample. They're sleeping much more similar to our European Canadian sample. Okay, and so this is beginning to question this idea. Well, maybe there's something about the these racial differences in sleep need. If that was the case, we'd expect our Asian Canadians to be more like our Japanese, but they weren't. So we also asked about people's napping, and Japanese and our Asian Canadian samples both reported napping more than our European Canadians, about 13 minutes a day. But that still was is a far cry from the 1 hour difference that we're finding in the nighttime sleep. So still, our Japanese sample is sleeping much less per day than our Canadian sample. So wanted to look at the efficiency of people sleeping, thinking maybe Japanese are just more efficient sleepers. That's not what we found. We actually found the opposite of that we found our Japanese sample was they were less efficient sleepers, meaning that the time that they're in bed, there's a smaller percent of the time they are sleeping compared to our Canadian samples. This has subsequently been replicated in a very large study with other Asian samples too. So this is really confusing now. I think that we're finding our Japanese samples not only sleeping less, not only in bed less, but while they're in bed, they're actually sleeping less than our Canadian samples. Um, the active watch, it would beat people a few times a day, and they were asked to indicate on a 1 to 5 scale how tired they were at that moment. And I think maybe Japanese are just really more tired. We found the opposite of that too. Our Canadians reported being more tired throughout the day than did our Japanese response. So our Japanese, despite sleeping less and sleeping less efficiently, are less tired than our Canadian samples. So this is really quite puzzling. Perhaps there's just cultural differences in how much demand is put on people's time. So maybe Japanese sleep less because they have to. So we asked people in an ideal world, how long would you like to sleep? And we still find about an hour's difference. Everyone wants to sleep longer than they do on average, but our Japanese samples still wanting to sleep about an hour less than our Canadian samples. We also asked people what they thought was the relationship between sleep duration and health, meaning that if you think that sleep duration is a longer sleep duration associated with health, you would answer on a positive number. Our scale went from -2 to +2. And if you thought longer sleep durations associated with worse health, you choose a negative answer. You can see all three of our groups are above 0, so they all see sleep duration as positively associated with health, but it's a Japanese far less so than our two Canadian groups. And we asked people to complete a symptom inventory of indicate their health at the beginning of the study and a week later at the end. And we found that controlling for their health at time one, that if anything, our Japanese sample is actually healthier over the course of the study. They were significantly different from the European Canadian sample at this. So this was all a very puzzling set of findings to us because we found here that Japanese sleep less than Canadians despite sleeping less efficiently, and yet they're being less tired. They seem to desire less sleep than our Canadian samples. They're less likely to view sleep and health as positively related. Japanese health was better than European Canadians across the study duration despite their shorter sleep. And our Asian Canadians and European Canadians do not differ on most measures, except for napping, where Asian Canadians napped more than European Canadians. So this study just raised even more questions than it provided answers for. But we have since done a couple other studies. I'll talk about the first one of these, Comparison International Sleep Data Sets, which is just published online today in PNAS. So this is very much hot off the presses. And in this investigation here, we found 14 different data sets that had cross-cultural comparisons of sleep duration, published data sets, or at least published papers where they compared sleep across cultures. And these varied in a variety of methods. Some had people wear fitness trackers, some used self-report, keeping sleep diary. Some had compared the amount of time between the time your phone is on at last at night and when it first turns on in the morning. And all of, yeah, so many different kinds of methods were used. And each data set had sleep data for a number of countries, from 7 to over 70. Um, and we have a total of 71 countries represented in across all of these data sets. And each country appears somewhere between 1 and 13 times for a total of 353 national observations. So that means each country on average is represented about 5 times across these 14 different data sets. And there's a very high interclass correlation here of these national means of sleep duration across these different investigations. So these are really quite stable. These cultural country rankings really seem to be quite stable, regardless of the very different methods that are using it and the different ages of the sample. The youngest sample is ones of in infants and toddlers, and they also have actually a similar difference in sleep duration for infants and toddlers around the world, as do the adult samples. So they seem to be really quite, these cultural differences seem to be quite stable across the lifespan. So I can say from this too. And so we wanted to explore whether the national average sleep durations predicted several outcomes that have been associated with sleep duration in the sleep literature. So specifically, we looked at whether these national sleep durations predicted national rates of heart disease, national rates of obesity, national rates of diabetes, and national life expectancy rates. And so, yeah, each of these variables has been found to be associated with shorter sleep duration within countries. And we included several controls in here. We looked at the wealth of the society. It's operationalized as GDP per capita. We had a nutrition index, which indicated just how healthy is the average diet in that country. We had an estimate of the latitude of the largest city in each country. And we had a measure of the inequality in the country as operationalized with a Gini coefficient. And I'll show you the results of that. So first, just looking at heart disease here, as you can see here, that national rates of sleep duration, the top line, were unrelated to national rates of heart disease. However, countries with better nutrition had less heart disease. Wealthier countries had less heart disease. Inequality was unrelated to heart disease. And countries further away from the equator tended to have more heart disease. Okay. Looking at obesity, we do see a significant relation between sleep duration and obesity. However, this is actually the opposite direction of what the literature looking within countries has found. Within countries, you see the relation that people who sleep shorter sleep durations on average are more likely to be obese. But at a national level, it's the countries with longer sleep durations on average that have more obesity. Okay. Here, nutrition, countries with worse nutrition had more obesity. Wealthier countries had more obesity. Inequality was unrelated to obesity. And countries further from the equator had more obesity. Looking at diabetes, we don't see any relation between national sleep duration and national diabetes, despite that nutrition in countries with better nutrition have lower rates of diabetes. Wealthier countries have more rates of diabetes. More unequal countries have more rates of diabetes, and countries closer to the equator have more rates of diabetes. And last, looking at life expectancy, again, we don't see a relation between national sleep duration and national rates of longevity. Countries with better nutrition live longer. Wealthier countries, on average, live longer. Countries with more inequality live shorter, and there wasn't a relation with latitude. So to summarize this investigation here, despite that, past research finds that within countries, shorter sleep durations are associated with all these harmful outcomes. we don't see that countries with shorter average sleep durations as being more likely to suffer from those same outcomes. The relation looks different at an aggregate level, a national level, than it does at the individual level. And this analysis has a number of limitations, but it does suggest, it raises the question that, well, maybe there are some different cultural norms regarding what is a healthy sleep duration. And one limitation in particular is that you often get these kinds of conflicting results between individual level data and aggregate data, and it's called the ecological fallacy when you do get these different relations between variables. And usually the ecological fallacy emerges because you haven't included a sufficient number of control variables. But ecological fallacy makes it difficult to interpret findings like this. And the best way of avoiding the ecological fallacy is to collect individual data across multiple countries. And that's what we did in our second study, which is published in this same paper. Here, we're looking to sleep duration predict health similarly across countries. And so we collected sleep duration and health data, all self-report data, from people in 20 countries on 6 continents with about 250 people per country via Qualtrics panels. And to be eligible for the study, you had to be between those ages of 25 and 60. I can't actually read that side of my screen. I think it says 60, and not be engaged in nighttime work. These are the countries that were included: Canada, Mexico, US, Argentina, Colombia, Costa Rica, Belgium, France, Netherlands, Spain, United Kingdom, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, and India. Okay. And we collect the data over the autumnal equinox, which was when the sun is on the equator. The length of the day is largely the same around the world, so that trying to control for that variable. And we measured sleep in 2 ways. We asked people last night, what time did you go to bed and what time did you wake up this morning? And then we also asked them about in a typical work day, what time do you go to bed? What time do you get up? On a typical weekend, what time do you go to bed? What time do you get up? On a typical day, how long do you nap? So we calculate sleep with those 2 different ways. I will say we've done all our analyses with both ways of operationalizing sleep. Last night's sleep seems to be the more accurate measure of people's sleep. You can see that the correlations with all of our criteria are all nominally higher with last night's sleep than typical day's sleep. So I think people are more accurate in calculating their last night's sleep. The results look the same. They're all significant in the same ways, regardless of which operationalization. But for the talk, I'm only going to talk about last night's sleep. And we had 4 different measures of health and well-being in the study. We had a measure of depression, anxiety, overall mental health, a number of 18 different chronic health conditions, whether people had them, and then an overall subjective rating of their physical health. And we find the same relations, the same pattern of results, and they're significant for each of those 4 different variables. And they all correlate together reasonably well. So I'm just going to show you results of a composite variable where we look at all 4 variables at once. But we get the same pattern that I'm going to be showing you with each of the individual variables as well. And then we included a measure of cultural fit to get back to this idea of cultural fit here. And we looked at what people said, what they think is their culture views as the right amount of sleep. And then we looked at how long did they actually sleep. And we looked at that gap as an index of cultural fit. People who were closer to their cultural ideals had better cultural fit. And people who were further from their sleep duration is further from their cultural ideals had worse cultural fit. And we then included several both country-level controls. We included a country-level nutrition index, gross domestic product, and Gini for inequality, and individual controls, people's attitudes towards health and sleep, whether they smoked, whether they drank, their income, their location for taking the survey, their age, and their gender. Okay. So first, just to so this is how long people slept their last night's sleep. It's again, Japan anchors the low end. and just not much over 6 hours sleep. Actually, the next three countries are also East Asian countries, and then US. US was a rather short sleeping country out of our context. And on the other extreme, France and other Western European and New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa also slept quite a bit. And so between the extremes, our French sample slept on average 94 minutes longer than our Japanese sample, which is a pretty substantial range when you think about it. That's like the average difference, an hour and a half. Um, we found that absolute latitude correlated with sleep duration. So people further from the equator slept a little longer. And that actually is something that's other research has found as well. And we also found that people's perceptions of their cultural norms, what they think their culture suggests as a good night's sleep, predicted how much sleep people reported. Okay. So we conducted multi-level analyses with individuals as level one, nested within countries, including all controls. Um, and we're looking here then at the relation between sleep duration centered within countries and health outcomes. So model one is first looking at the linear relation between that. And yes, and what we see here is that last night's sleep was linearly significantly related to reported health, so that people who slept longer, um, on average, were reporting better health. This is centered within countries. People slept longer compared with the others in their country, on average, had better health. Okay. We also looked here at the country levels sleep for last night. At a national level, we find that the people who are from countries that had shorter sleep duration did not have worse health than those that had longer sleep duration. So this is along the lines of the findings I showed you in the previous investigation. So at the national level, we don't see these same relations, although this particular study is underpowered because we only have 20 countries here. Next, we looked at a quadratic relation between sleep duration and health. Like, is there a nonlinear relation? And the reason we do this too is that actually one thing that's not discussed nearly as much from the sleep literature is it's not just that short sleep durations are associated with worse health. Too long sleep durations are also associated with worse health. And I think the reason this isn't talked about as much is because it's perceived to be a different causal relation. So it's believed that short sleep duration causes worse health, but it's not perceived that longer sleep durations are causing worse health. It's rather that when people are sick and aren't very healthy, they're often sleeping longer. They're often in bed longer. So, but anyways, you typically find a relation shaped like that. And we found that same relation here. So we do find across the board here that there is this curvilinear relation, so that both short sleep, too short a sleep, and too long a sleep were both associated with poorer health overall. Okay? But given that each country here has the significant quadratic effect, we were interested in calculating the turning point for the curve. If you think of plotting sleep duration on the x-axis and health on the y-axis, and there's a curve like this, at some point the curve turns. That's the point associated with the highest level of health. So what sleep duration is associated with the optimal level of health in each country? And so you get a graph that looks like this. Um, and first, one thing to note is in each of the 20 countries, the turning point, the sleep duration that was associated with the optimal health is higher than the national average sleep duration by more than an hour higher. So one interpretation from this is maybe the whole world would be better off if we all slept about an hour more at night. We'd be closer to that higher part on the curve, which is associated with better health. But a key point from this is that these turning points are significantly different from each other. Okay, that across these 20 countries, the amount of sleep duration that's associated with optimal health here varies between countries. This is suggesting that that how much sleep that is associated with the most positive health outcomes is varying significantly between these countries. Okay, it seems that it's not all pointing to the same universal standard of 8 hours or however many hours. Rather, across these 20 different countries, there were different sleep durations that were associated with optimal health. Okay. And then in the model three, we included our cultural fit variable, the deviation between actual sleep duration and cultural ideal sleep duration. And what we find here is that people who slept closer to their cultural norms reported better health. So that those people who were more similar to their cultural norms for sleep, on average, actually reported having better health. So this suggests here that cultural fit matters for sleep too. Sleeping in ways that are more similar to the norms of your culture associated with better health. Okay, so what does all this mean? Well, first, despite that sleep research, which is usually conducted within countries, reliably finds that shorter sleep durations are associated with all of these health ills, those same effects don't seem to hold between countries. Shorter sleep in countries don't seem to be suffering more than longer sleeping countries. And so we hypothesize here that people are learning cultural norms for a typical night's sleep, just as we're learning things, many other aspects of our lives. And these norms that people are learning, they vary by as much as an hour and a half in duration between countries. This suggests that there's a learning element to sleep, that it's not just that we resort to some sort of innate species-wide sort of sleep norms, that it's shaped by our local cultural norms. And health problems may be associated with deviations from a local cultural norm rather than deviations from a species-wide standard. And so this points to an explanation of cultural fit. People who have sleep durations that are more similar to their country's norms tend to be healthier. Okay? But so saying this raises some big unanswered questions here. One is our data here don't speak to how these different cultural norms came to be. Why is it that these cultural norms are so much shorter in Asia than they are in Western Europe, for instance? We have some new data that speaks to this somewhat. We looked at a big representative sample in China of a survey conducted by the Chinese government. And what this revealed is that people living in the rice growing regions of China sleep less than people growing in the wheat growing regions of China. That's especially for those engaged in agriculture. And why this might be relevant, actually, in cultural psychology, we often turn to the common means of subsistence within cultures. And one thing that's unique about rice farming is that it's far more labor intensive than other kinds of farming, that the extra hours you put in make a difference in your yield. And so maybe this led to this idea of that if you can be working more and thereby sleeping less, that these norms might have emerged. Anyways, these norms seem to be old, that Confucius says some things that sound like he's saying, don't sleep too long. And so that these do seem to be old norms. And so our data suggests maybe it has something to do with rice farming being associated with shorter sleep duration norms. We don't have any data on the rest of the world, though. Um, Also, our study doesn't speak to how do people come to learn cultural norms for sleep duration. I find this to be really puzzling because sleep is a private part of our lives, right? It's kind of an odd thing to think that there's a norm for how to sleep when you really don't know that much about how long other people sleep outside from the people in your household. We don't talk about it that much. So how is it that we come to learn these norms? One possibility is we talk about it enough that we know if we're sleeping more or less than others. So maybe there is some communication on these norms, or maybe it's the way society is structured, that offices open at 9 a.m., transit starts at a certain time, primetime television's at a certain time. And so maybe there's sort of a structure of society that communicates these norms. Our data don't speak to that, and I think it's a really big, curious question. And last, our study too, like these other studies in culture fit, don't specify what are the mechanisms for how cultural fit of sleep duration is associated with better health. Is it just being a subjective feeling that I think I'm sleeping the right amount? Maybe that contributes to it. Is it that there'd be some objective friction if you're sleeping at odds with this, that maybe you're often late for work because you're not sleeping enough, getting up, so you're really tired and more stressed. Maybe that's the relation, or maybe there people who sleep at odds with their culture are more genetically atypical in some ways, and that those same genetic atypicalities might be associated with worse health. Our study doesn't speak to those mechanisms, so it's really quite unclear. So these are some big unanswered questions. The unanswered questions here, I think, are especially large and challenging. And what we're doing next is we're going to look at sleep architecture. A typical sleep cycle goes like this, where you go through different stages of sleep. Um, N1 and N2 are not particularly deep sleep, and N3 is where a lot of like the memory consolidation and brain detoxification happens, and then through REM sleep. And it's thought that people typically go through 5 cycles of sleep. It would seem that there must be differences in the sleep architecture across cultures. If French are in bed an hour and a half longer than Japanese people, are they getting an extra? Are French people getting an extra cycle than Japanese? Are Japanese people getting more N3 sleep in their earlier waves? We just have an agreement with Aura, who makes a ring that actually can remarkably, they have an algorithm in this ring that you wear with biomarkers that can recreate sleep architecture reasonably well to try to investigate that. Okay. So to sum up, there's clear benefits associated with being a better cultural fit. Fitting into your culture, being more similar to those around you is associated with a variety of measures of health and well-being. And that also seems to hold even for something as private as our sleep. So thank you very much for listening. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heine, for that really interesting presentation. All I could think about was like thinking of my sleeping patterns that I've had, and I'm like, oh, how to optimize speed. It's like, okay, wait, it doesn't matter about efficiency. We do have a question here from Victoria Medellin. They ask, is there a relationship between longer sleep durations and depression and or suicide rates?
Um, yes. So depression shows this same. I don't know the data for suicide rates, but depression and suicide are quite strongly suicidality are quite strongly related. So I would imagine so. But you do see this curvilinear relationship too that with depression, that people who have really short sleep durations on average are more depressed, and that people who have very long sleep durations also are a greater risk of depression. Um, they might, and I'm not sure if it's through different mechanisms, the short sleep duration and the long sleep duration, but you do find that with depression, and so I'm assuming suicidality as well, but I don't know of direct evidence on suicidality.
Thank you so much. I think, oh, and then another question from Victoria about the next steps. Will the sleep cycle of menopause be examined in depth, a waking
Oh,
up at 2 to 3 a.m.?
interesting. That's a great point. It depends on what the Aura data has.
Mm,
I don't know if we'll have access to any questionnaire response data. I think we're just getting access to the basic ring data, which has health indicators and sleep indicators. Um, but that would be a great thing to look at. Um, yeah, we weren't planning on that because uh, I don't think there's any menopausal data from the Aura ring, or maybe you could collect it. I find it remarkable that a ring can tell you all of this much about yourself. They predict all these different aspects of your life, um, their algorithms. But yeah, I don't know about menopause. Um, I see another question here about from Michaela. So what about on the other end of the spectrum, anxiety, ADHD, PTSD? Do these individuals sleep less? Um, Good question. I do know that problem sleeping is something that is common with PTSD, and anxiety. I know shows this curvilinear relation. ADHD, off the top of my head, I don't recall what the relation between ADHD and sleep duration is. Perhaps they sleep less as well. I mean, the general pattern for so many health conditions is they're associated with shorter sleep. So really, I think it's more unusual when there's a health condition that doesn't show that relation. So I would expect it would be also so for ADHD.
I
Okay.
think, well, oh, perfect. Dr. CJ has a comment question.
In countries like
And
I can read. In countries like Spain and certain South Latin American countries where traditionally people would take the afternoon siesta, have been there studies on the quality of their sleep and any sleep-related health issues. Sorry if this was discussed earlier. There might be. I actually don't know enough about that literature on siesta cultures. I mean, maybe our data with the Aura ring will speak to that because it does identify when you're napping. But anyways, I mean, there is a literature out there about these siesta cultures, but I don't recall uh, it being comparative in terms of predicting health outcomes differently than cultures without um, these siesta cultures. On average, though, I would just point out that, at least in Europe, Spain is a siesta culture historically, and Greece. They actually are pretty long living countries. They're pretty healthy countries. They also have the Mediterranean diet going for them. Uh, so I do think these studies really to do them well, you'd want to be able to control much more for individual level diet, which is a little more difficult. Is there a difference for age by country? Yes, we did control for that, and we did see a relation for that. And yeah, older people in all 20 countries slept less than younger people. Um, it's unfortunately it's a part of all of our futures as we get older. We're probably going to sleep less.
I think for me, one of the questions that comes up is like acculturation and how that may affect sleep. So we have established that it has something to do with more of like how the individual aligns with the norm of their country. But I
Yeah.
think of the Rio Grande Valley, where a lot of us come from a different culture, and we
Hmm.
are all in this pocket in Texas where a lot of our cultural norms followed that back of home. And it seemed
Yeah.
like thankfully the US and Mexico had similar-ish sleeping
Yeah.
cultures, but
Yeah.
I wonder how that acculturation aspect, if it follows through with sleep,
Yeah.
just further
No.
impacts in general.
Yeah. No, that's a really a great question. I'm part of a big grant application where we're going to hopefully be able to look at that. Because the puzzle is, to me, at least what I think is the big puzzle is you see these national differences in sleep duration by the age of infancy. So like at least one these parental report data. Um,
Mhm.
but Japanese babies sleep the least in the world, and they sleep about an hour and a half less than New Zealand babies. Even though the babies everywhere are sleeping maybe 4 hours longer than adults are sleeping, but that national difference is there. Yet when we look at acculturated Asian Canadians, they sleep like European Canadians.
Mhm.
So if there's this cultural learning of sleep, it happens really early. I'm
Mhm.
guessing, I'm inferring from this. And then of our Asian Canadian sample, we had people who had immigrated. I think about one third of our Asian Canadian sample had immigrated, and two-thirds were born in Canada. We didn't find a significant difference in their sleep, but it is a pretty small sample that we had. But I do think our results suggest that you do acculturate to these different norms or sleep and how you learn those is a question I struggle with trying to think of, well, how is it that when you move to a new place, you pick up on these cultural norms? Maybe if you're living in a dormitory, then you sort of get, when there are other people going to bed. Um, but yeah, I think the acculturation of sleep duration is a really interesting question that hasn't been studied yet, to my knowledge. Um, okay, better health was defined objectively. It was self-report. Um, and what we did. So we had a measure of whether said you had one of 18 different chronic health conditions. Um, and then we had a measure of depression and a measure of mental health, and then just a measure of overall, I think on a 100-point scale, rate your subjective physical health. So we only had self-report data, and it's limited in that way. That's why I'm excited about getting to analyze the Aura Ring data, because that is an objective measure of health and an objective measure of sleep duration, and with very large samples. So I'm hoping we'll be able to replicate our findings and have greater precision in our estimates of what is the optimal range of sleep. So we do calculate these curves do vary across cultures, but there's the sample size isn't I'm not confident in the precision of those estimates of what is the optimal sleep duration because it's a it's not a very large sample that we have right now. But I think with the Aura data, um, we'll be able to many thousands of people per country will be able to get a better understanding of that, and with these objective measures, which is a real limitation of the self-report. Because part of this, the one limitation of the self-report is people might report more on what these cultural norms that they think they should be sleeping, right? That I hear I'm supposed to sleep 8 hours, so maybe I remember sleeping 8 hours last night, even though that's different than what I actually slept. So that's a real limitation with the self-report and with health reporting as well. And gender differences across. I'm trying to, we had inconsistent gender differences, if I'm remembering this right, that some cultures showed it and some didn't. Um, and and I actually don't remember what was the direction of those differences. I remember it being inconsistent. We included as a control variable in all our analyses. Um, but sorry, I don't recall the details of it any more that was inconsistent.
Yeah, I find the self-reporting really interesting because when talking about culture, like you mentioned, like the open office, and I can imagine the cultures where like suffer you have to suffer to succeed,
Mm,
and in those cultures, like admitting that you need the sleep is shown as weakness. So
yeah,
it's so interesting.
yeah. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that point, and I do think the self-report is a real limitation of what we've done so far. Our first study, we did have objective measure of sleep, not of that our health variable, and that was self-report. Um, but I I'm more confident that our sleep duration results are reasonably accurate, even though they're self-report, at least in terms of these rank orderings of the countries on studies that compare them with objective measures and study that compares with self-report look very similar. So there may be some biases in them, but I don't think that's what's leading to this pattern of the rank ordering of countries that we found, because you find it with more objective measures too. Okay. I'm confused. You're in bed 9 hours, 47 minutes, but you're sleeping 11 hours and 14 minutes. Um, I, um, so it sounds like you have the wow, that's um, that if you wake up and then go to bed a little bit later, that's that same intermittent sleep pattern that was common in medieval Europe and in some small scale societies around the world. Um, and yeah, perhaps that's what happens if a very early bedtime that that happens. So that's funny though that the Apple at yeah. One reason why I think the Aura ring is good for this is that people wear a ring to bed without any issues. Sleep, I mean, there's apps on your phone that estimate your sleep from your breathing. Um, and I don't know, maybe that's pretty accurate. The Apple Watch, if you're wearing it at night, it should be accurate. But you have to charge it too, and so that's part of the challenge with using the watch.
Okay. So I don't know if there's any more questions or concerns or comments for Dr. Hyde, but seriously, thank you so much for being part of this presentation. We learned a lot, and hopefully we get to learn more about sleep and the differences in the future.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
your
I
questions.
appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. And then just real quick before I let everybody go, these are our announcements. So for next week, we will have Dr. Dani Marrero, uh, and they're going to be presenting on this case from Switzerland titled Lima Senior Inn. And it's talking about climate and human rights, particularly towards senior citizens. And that will be in 2 Tuesdays. The TARC application is still open and it's still due July 15th. There are 4 funding mechanisms available. If you want information for that, just let me know and I'll send you that information. And just a quick congratulations to Dr. Jesus Melgarejo on his American Heart Association Award, which is under the career development for his study of 24-hour blood pressure to describe complex cardiovascular dynamic systems. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here today, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.